April 1945. The Texas wind moved like a living thing, dry, patient, and endless. Dust drifted across a rodeo arena carved into the earth outside Camp Hearne. Inside the fence, 50 German women stood in rigid silence, their khaki dresses bleached by the sun. The war was nearing its end, though no one yet knew how. Helga Brandt rested her hands on the wooden rail. She was 24, a nurse from Hamburg who'd been captured in Italy and shipped halfway across the world to this strange, sunburned land. Everything about America unsettled her. The laughter, the food, the strange kindness that defied reason. She had seen men die for far less back home. That morning, a group of cowboys rode into the camp. Their hats, their boots, even the cadence of their voices felt foreign but not hostile. One of them tipped his hat and said to the camp officer, "Got a few horses we can spare. Thought the ladies might like some fresh air." Fresh air. The word struck Helga as ridiculous. Prisoners didn't get fresh air. Prisoners got orders, fear, rations, not sunlight. The gate creaked open. A U.S. sergeant motioned for them to follow. No rifles aimed at their backs, no shouting, just quiet curiosity. The cowboys led the horses into the middle of the arena. Sunlight glimmered on their brown coats. The animals looked strong, alive, symbols of everything the war had stolen. One of the Americans, a tall ranch hand with gentle eyes, held out the reins to Helga. "You ride?" he asked. She froze. Her mind leapt to the last horse she had seen. A starving creature in a bombed-out village near Rome. "9," she whispered. "Not anymore," he smiled. "Well, you will again." She hesitated, expecting laughter, mockery, a cruel trick. But none came. Slowly, she took the reins. The horse's breath was warm, steady. The cowboy nodded. "Easy now, just trust him. He knows what to do." Her heart pounded as she swung her leg over the saddle. The world swayed beneath her. For a moment, she thought she'd fall. But then the horse moved, solid and sure. She lifted her gaze and the sky seemed impossibly wide. Around her, the other women gasped and clung to each other as they were helped onto their mounts. Then came the unexpected applause. From the Americans, the same men who had fought against their brothers, who had guarded them for months. Helga guided her horse forward, clumsily at first, then with growing confidence. Dust swirled around her boots. The wind tugged at her hair. She smiled. A real smile, the first in years. She didn't know that a camera was clicking nearby, capturing the moment when fear gave way to freedom. That night, she wrote in her diary, "They took away our uniforms, our pride, and our country. But today, for 1 hour, they gave us something back. The feeling of being alive." In that arena, the prisoners weren't enemies. They were women riding beneath a vast Texas sky, watched by men who had discovered that compassion could be stronger than any weapon. For Helga Brandt, it was the first day she began to believe mercy might outlive war. Months before that day in the arena, Helga Brandt had boarded a crowded transport train in Italy. Her wrists ached from the rope that bound them. The German army was collapsing, and the women who had served as Red Cross nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries were now captives of the very men they'd been taught to despise. Rumors moved faster than the train, that Americans executed prisoners, that they humiliated women, that they left them to starve in open fields. One officer had told them, "The Americans are barbarians with machines. Better to die than be taken alive." And yet, here she was, heading west toward a land she didn't comprehend. The journey was long. Ships, trains, and finally trucks that carried them deep into the Texas plains. Through the slits in the canvas, Helga saw endless fields, blinding sun, and people who smiled as the convoy passed. She couldn't reconcile it with the stories she'd heard. When they reached Camp Hearne, the first surprise came before they even stepped inside. A U.S. sergeant, barely 20, offered her water, clean, cold water in a metal cup. "You'll get a bath and a meal soon, ma'am," he said. She thought she had misheard. Ma'am? No one had called her that since before the war. Inside the camp, they were searched politely, given fresh linens, and shown to wooden barracks with real beds, mattresses filled with cotton, sheets that smelled faintly of soap. Helga sat on her bunk and whispered to the woman beside her, "This can't be real." That night they were served stew with chunks of meat, bread still warm from the oven, and a small apple for dessert. It was more food than she had seen in weeks. Some refused to eat, fearing poison. Others cried quietly, torn between hunger and disbelief. The Americans watched without ridicule. One guard simply said, "You'll get used to it." In the days that followed, Helga began to see more contradictions. The guards didn't yell. The commandant held meetings explaining the rules in both English and German. Prisoners were encouraged to start reading circles and even perform music in the recreation hall. It felt unreal. Back home, even loyal Germans had lived in fear of their own government. Here, their enemies treated them with dignity. In her journal, Helga wrote, "We were told America had no soul, that it was a land of machines and greed. But the men here laugh, sing, and speak kindly to us. How can that be the enemy?" One morning, she saw 2 American nurses tending to an elderly German woman who had fainted. They worked gently, calling her Frau as they fanned her face and gave her medicine. Helga stood frozen, watching. No propaganda had prepared her for such compassion without condition. The fear that had ruled her since capture began to unravel, thread by thread. At night, she heard the camp settling, boots crunching on gravel, a harmonica somewhere in the distance, the quiet hum of voices in 2 languages. For the first time in months, Helga didn't dream of bombs or sirens. She dreamed of horses, open fields, and a calm voice saying, "You'll be all right now." She woke in America and realized captivity wasn't always the prison she had imagined. By the spring of 1944, the United States had quietly built one of the largest prisoner-of-war systems in history. Across 46 states, more than 400,000 Axis POWs, Germans, Italians, and Japanese, were held in camps scattered across the countryside, from California to Georgia. Texas alone housed over 70,000 of them. Scattered across 24 facilities surrounded, not by fortress walls, but by barbed wire and open sky, it was an operation of staggering scale. The U.S. Army's Prost Marshal General oversaw the program under the Geneva Convention, determined to prove that America could fight fiercely, yet remain humane. Every prisoner received medical care, male privileges, religious freedom, and 3 meals a day, a standard that astonished even American citizens still living under rationing. For most Texans, the arrival of the prisoners was an inconvenience that quickly turned into an opportunity. With millions of men overseas, farms and ranches faced crippling labor shortages. The War Department allowed PS to work voluntarily, earning small wages redeemable for camp canteen goods. Soon, German and Italian laborers were harvesting cotton, baling hay, repairing fences, and even building barns, all under supervision, but with a freedom few had expected. It was in this system that women like Helga Brandt were eventually integrated. Though their presence was rare and heavily restricted, most female PS were nurses or clerical workers captured during campaigns in Italy and North Africa. To the surprise of their captors, they often adapted more quickly than male soldiers, driven by practicality rather than pride. At Camp Hearne, the rules were clear. Prisoners could not be mistreated, and guards could not fraternize beyond necessary interaction. Yet humanity has a way of defying policy. Over time, small acts of courtesy, a shared cigarette, a word of encouragement, a smile during inspection, began to thaw the ice between captor and captive. The Army even distributed pamphlets to camp personnel titled "The Enemy as a Human Being." It reminded guards that fair treatment wasn't charity, It was strategy. Every prisoner treated with dignity, the manual read, is a message carried home to the enemy that our cause is just. For the German PS, this philosophy was disorienting. They had been raised on visions of the ruthless Anglo-American machine, greedy, mechanical, soulless. But in the heat of Texas, surrounded by cowboys and farmers, they found something that contradicted every speech they'd ever heard. Ordinary decency. Helga noticed it most in the details. When a woman's shoes wore through, an American officer arranged replacements from a local store. When the camp's small library ran out of German books, a church in nearby Bryan donated English ones so they could learn something useful. The pastor wrote, "She began to see that this wasn't an accident. It was policy backed by principle. The United States didn't just win battles. It managed victory with conscience." Historians would later calculate that the U.S. spent over $1.88 billion, the equivalent of nearly $30 billion today maintaining humane standards for Axis prisoners. Germany, by contrast, had spent less than half that on feeding its own troops. Helga couldn't have known those numbers then, but she could feel their truth every time she ate, slept, or walked beneath the sky without gunfire. The irony was unbearable. She had come to the land of her enemies, and it was the first place that had treated her like a human being. In her diary, she wrote one simple line that would survive long after the war. "They called it a prison. I called it civilization." As weeks passed, Helga began to see the American war machine not just as a force of destruction, but as something far stranger. An empire of organization built on ordinary people doing their jobs well. The camp itself became proof of that system's reach. Food arriving on schedule, uniforms laundered weekly, medical inspections conducted with precision. Every detail was measured, documented, executed. One morning, she overheard a conversation between two American guards during the breakfast. One of them, a young Texan named Corporal Miller, was reading from a newspaper. Says here, "The government spends over $5 a day per prisoner." He said, "That's more than some folks make working sun up to sundown." The other guard shrugged. "That's America, I guess. We fight mean, but we treat folks fair. Keeps our boys safe when the tables turn." Helga's spoon froze midway to her mouth. $5 a day? She did the math in her head. Enough to feed a German family for a week. The realization sank in like a stone. The United States was not just wealthy. It was choosing to be moral, even when it didn't have to be. Later that afternoon, she spoke to the camp interpreter, a German-American woman named Ruth, who volunteered for the Red Cross. "Why do they spend so much?" Helga asked quietly. "We are the enemy," Ruth smiled. "Because if they stop treating you like humans, they stop being who they are." That night, Helga couldn't sleep. She thought of Berlin under bombardment, of civilians hiding in basement, of her mother trading jewelry for bread. She thought of the Reich's promises, glory, unity, destiny, all built on fear and scarcity. And then she thought of this strange, prosperous country that could feed both its soldiers and its prisoners without collapsing. The contrast was unbearable. When she wrote in her journal that evening, her words trembled. "In Germany, we were told mercy was weakness. But here, I see it as power. The Americans have so much that they can't afford to be kind, and that terrifies me more than their bombs." Historians later confirmed the scale of that kindness. By 1945, the U.S. government had spent over $1.88 billion maintaining humane standards for prisoners, equivalent to nearly $30 billion in modern value. Each German P received 3,200 calories a day, access to doctors, dental care, and even schooling programs. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Europe, civilians starved on half that. But Helga didn't need statistics to feel the weight of that difference. She saw it in every meal, every clean bandage, every act that quietly declared, "We don't have to hate you to win." A week later, during a Red Cross inspection, an American officer explained to visiting journalists, "We believe a well-fed enemy works harder and fights less. It was meant as a logistical statement. Buto Helga. It sounded almost spiritual. That evening she shared her rations with a fellow prisoner, a frail woman from Dresden who had stopped eating out of guilt. "Take it," Helga whispered. "If we live, we must live remembering this." She didn't yet realize that the true weapon America had built wasn't its factories or guns. It was its belief that compassion was good policy. And somewhere between the numbers and the meals, Helga Brandt began to understand the economics of decency. That mercy, when multiplied, could dismantle an empire of hate. It began as a joke. A few of the German women, restless from routine, stood near the fence one afternoon, watching a group of cowboys bring their horses near the edge of the camp. The men were laughing, adjusting saddles, dust rising, and golden clouds around them. To Helga and the others, it looked absurd, a childish display. One of the prisoners muttered, "Barbarians on animals, this is what America calls civilization." Another snickered, "No wonder they have so many machines they can't ride properly." Their laughter was sharp, nervous, the kind that hides confusion. But one of the cowboys overheard them. He didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled and said, "You think we can't ride? How about you try?" The women froze. The translator hesitated before relaying the words. The German women stared in disbelief. Ride? Prisoners didn't get to ride. Horses were for guards, not captives. Helga crossed her arms. "It's a trick," she whispered to the others. But the cowboy simply opened the gate and motioned them forward. "Come on, ma'am. Ain't no trick. Let's see if you're better than us." What happened next rippled through the camp for days. One by one, the women approached. The cowboys adjusted the stirrups, offered their hands for balance, and with effortless patience helped the prisoners mount the horses. The camp guards watched in stunned silence. Technically, this broke half a dozen rules, but nobody stopped it. Helga's heart pounded as the horse shifted beneath her. It had been years since she had felt something alive beneath her hands. She gripped the res awkwardly at first, then more firmly as the cowboy guided her around the small paddock. "Tunai seed." "Not bad," he said with a grin. "Told you it's more fun than standing around mocking us." She couldn't help herself. She laughed. Not the brittle laugh of fear, but something real. For a moment, she forgot the barbed wire, forgot the war. She was just a woman on a horse under a vast blue sky. When she dismounted, she felt tears stinging her eyes. "Why?" she asked him softly. "Why do this for us?" The cowboy shrugged. "Ma'am, your folks same as us. War has got a funny way of making people forget that." That night, word spread across the camp. Even those who hadn't been near the fence could feel that something had shifted. Guards moved with less stiffness. The German women spoke with more warmth. The sound of laughter echoed longer after roll call. Helga sat in her bunk and wrote in her journal, "We mocked them, and they offered us joy. They turned humiliation into grace. I no longer know who the victors are." Tyranny wasn't lost on anyone. A group of prisoners who had once seen themselves as superior had been humbled not by violence, but by generosity. The cowboy hadn't meant to make a statement. They had simply acted out of instinct. The same instinct that had built America's strange, disarming strength. To Helga, that day became a parable she would never forget. Power, she realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it tipped its hat, smiled, and handed you the reins. The mockery that began as laughter had transformed into a quiet reckoning. For days afterward, the camp felt different. The German women walked with less defiance, their voices slower, their gestures slower. Something unspoken had shifted inside them. Not just humiliation, but the uneasy birth of understanding. Helga, who had once held herself above these cowboys, couldn't shake the feeling that her entire idea of superiority had collapsed with that ride. Each night, she replayed the moment in her mind. The firm but gentle hand that had helped her mount the horse. The freedom she'd felt for those few minutes, and the warmth that followed when she dismounted to applause instead of ridicule. It was absurd. Her captors had shown her more respect than the officers of her own army. A week later, the numbers arrived. The camp received its monthly inspection report from the Prost Marshal's office. Helga overheard the interpreter reading it aloud to one of the guards. The U.S. government, it said, had spent $1.88 billion maintaining humane conditions for access prisoners. Food, medicine, housing, clothing, even recreation. Helga did the math. That amount could have fed entire cities in Germany. Could have saved children from starvation. Yet there, in a land she was told was heartless and greedy, her captives spent fortunes not on cruelty, but on comfort. That night she wrote in her diary, "We lost not because they had more weapons, but because they had more humanity." She thought of her father, a loyal Nazi bureaucrat who used to say, "Mercy is ad effect of weak nations." Now, sitting in a Texas barrack under a soft electric light, she realized mercy was the only true display of power. The collapse came slowly, not with tears, but with arithmetic. Helga began listing what she received each day: 2 hot meals, a clean bed, coffee, soap, freedom to write, access to books, medical care, dignity. The sum total exceeded what many Germans at home now lived on. When she shared her thoughts with the other women, some scoffed, clinging to pride. "It's all a trick," one insisted. "They're trying to make us grateful." Helga shook her head. "Then the trick is working because I am—" There was laughter, uneasy at first, but even that laughter lacked conviction. The truth was plain for anyone willing to see it. The Americans didn't need to humiliate their enemies to prove their superiority. They simply let decency do the work. For the first time, Helga understood what her guard meant when he said, "You fight a man's body. You win a day. You fight his hate. You win forever." She realized that her nation's ideology, all its talk of destiny, blood, and honor, had produced only ruins. But here in the middle of Texas, surrounded by men who wore dusty hats instead of iron crosses, she saw something indestructible: faith in human worth. As she finished her entry that night, she wrote one final line, simple, almost mathematical in its precision. "They defeated us without a single insult, just food." And that was the truth of it. The mockery that began as laughter had transformed into a quiet reckoning. For days afterward, the camp felt different. The German women walked with less defiance, their voices lower, their gestures slower. Something unspoken had shifted inside them. Not just humiliation, but the uneasy birth of understanding. Helga, who had once held herself above these cowboys, couldn't shake the feeling that her entire idea of superiority had collapsed with that ride. Each night she replayed the moment in her mind. The firm but gentle hand that had helped her mount the horse, the freedom she'd felt for those few minutes, and the warmth that followed when she dismounted to applause instead of ridicule. It was absurd. Her captors had shown her more respect than the officers of her own army. A week later, the numbers arrived. The camp received its monthly inspection report from the Prost Marshal's office. Helga overheard the interpreter reading it aloud to one of the guards. The U.S. government, it said, had spent $1.8 billion maintaining humane conditions for access prisoners: food, medicine, housing, clothing, even recreation. Helga did the math. That amount could have fed entire cities in Germany, could have saved children from starvation. Yet here in a land she was told was heartless and greedy, her captors spent fortunes not on cruelty, but on comfort. That night she wrote in her diary, "We lost not because they had more weapons, but because they had more humanity." She'd thought of her father, a loyal Nazi bureaucrat who used to say, "Mercy is ad effect of weak nations." Now, sitting in a Texas barrack under a soft electric light, she realized mercy was the only true display of power. The collapse came slowly, not with tears, but with arithmetic. Helga began listing what she received each day: 2 hot meals, a clean bed, coffee, soap, freedom to write, access to books, medical care, dignity. The sum total exceeded what many Germans at home now lived on. When she shared her thoughts with the other women, some scoffed, clinging to pride. "It's all a trick," one insisted. "They're trying to make us grateful." Helga shook her head. "Then the trick is working because I am—" There was laughter, uneasy at first, but even that laughter lacked conviction. The truth was plain for anyone willing to see it. The Americans didn't need to humiliate their enemies to prove their superiority. They simply let decency do the work. For the first time, Helga understood what her guard meant when he said, "You fight a man's body. You win a day. You fight his hate. You win forever." She realized that her nation's ideology, all its talk of destiny, blood, and honor, had produced only ruins. But here in the middle of Texas, surrounded by men who wore dusty hats instead of iron crosses, she saw something indestructible: faith in human worth. As she finished her entry that night, she wrote one final line, simple, almost mathematical in its precision. "They defeated us without a single insult. Just food." And that was the truth of it. Spring came early that year. Warm winds rolling across the Texas plains. The air smelled faintly of hay and mesquite smoke, and even the guards seemed lighter. Rumors spread through the camp. The war was nearly over. Helga was hanging laundry behind the women's barracks when she saw him again. The same cowboy who'd helped her mount a horse weeks before. His hat waist-tilted low against the sun, his boots coated in dust, a small paper sack in his hands. He waved almost shyly. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said through the fence. "Got something for you." Helga frowned. "For me?" "Figure maybe for all of you," he replied, holding up the sack. Inside were small jars of homemade preserves, plum and peach, sealed with wax. "My wife makes too many. Thought maybe y'all could use some sweetness out here." Helga hesitated. Acts of kindness still made her uneasy, as though they were traps waiting to snap shut. But the cowboy's expression was plain, almost embarrassed. He pushed the bag through the gap in the fence. "War's nearly over," he said softly. "You ladies, just hang in there." Helga wanted to say something sharp, a way Tor claim a little pride, but nothing came. Instead, she felt the words dissolve in her throat. She reached out and shook his hand through the wire. It was the first time she had ever touched an American willingly. The other women gathered as she opened the jars. The smell of fruit filled the barracks. Simple, sweet, unthreatening. For Amament, it reminded them of home before the war, of mothers and sisters who had once baked with care instead of rationing crumbs. Some began to cry quietly. That night, Helga wrote again in her journal. "He brought jam," she wrote. "Not as a soldier, but as a man. He said nothing about victory or defeat, only that we should hold on. Perhaps this is what strength looks like when it has nothing left to prove." The next morning, the women brought a small gift in return. A handkerchief embroidered with flowers made from a scrap of old uniform cloth. They asked the guard to deliver it to the cowboy. When he received it, he reportedly smiled and said, "Guess we're even now." In another camp, such a gesture might have been forbidden. Here it became a quiet legend. The handshake between the cowboy and the German woman spread through the camp like wildfire. Guards repeated it to newcomers. Prisoners retold it in their letters. It was proof that humanity could survive even inside fences. Helga never saw the cowboy again. A few weeks later, word arrived that Germany had surrendered. The camp was silent that night. No celebration, no anger, just exhaustion. Some cried, others stared at the floor, too empty for emotion. Helga sat outside under the stars, clutching the handkerchief she'd made from her own sleeve. She whispered a prayer she hadn't said in years. She whispered a prayer she hadn't said in years. Not for victory, but for peace. In her final diary entry, she wrote, "I once believed decency belonged only to the victors, but now I know it belongs to anyone brave enough to practice it first." The next morning, as trucks rolled in to begin repatriation, she saw the horses grazing near the fence. She smiled faintly. "You taught me more than our Reich ever did." she murmured. "You taught me how to be human again." And in that moment, Texas, the land she'd once called her prison, became the place where her hate finally died. By the time the war officially ended, the Texas sky seemed whiter than ever. The barbed wire around the camp no longer felt like a cage, more like a fragile reminder of what had once divided the world. The guards had relaxed. The women were allowed to walk in small groups under supervision, and the air buzzed with a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Helga stood outside one morning, staring at the horizon. The sunrise painted the plains gold, and for a fleeting moment, she forgot she was a prisoner. In that silence, a thought crystallized, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "They called them cowboys," she whispered. "We call them fools. But it turns out the fools were us." That sentence later appeared in her post-war memoir, written years after she returned home. It became her most quoted line. But in that moment, it was just truth spoken softly into the morning air. What Helga and her fellow PSWs learned in Texas wasn't written in any military manual. They learned that kindness could disarm more effectively than bullets, and that dignity shown to an enemy could rebuild what war had destroyed. When the camp finally closed, a U.S. Army chaplain gave a short farewell speech. "Honid, Chazid, you will go home," he said. "But I hope you carry with you what this country tried to show, that strength isn't cruelty, and mercy isn't weakness." Many of the women wept. Some tried to hide it, but the tears came anyway. They weren't crying because they were prisoners leaving. They were crying because they were leaving the first place that had treated them as people, instead of tools of ideology. Helga walked past the gate that had confined her for over a year. The same guard who once searched her suitcase now handed it back and said, "Take care, ma'am. You were a good neighbor." She smiled faintly. "And you were a good man." In Germany, the returnees faced disbelief. When Helga described how American soldiers had treated them, the food, the horses, the barbecue, the laughter, no one believed her at first. "You're lying," one neighbor hissed. "They would never show mercy." Helga only replied, "That's what I thought too." Over time, her testimony and those of other PS began to circulate. Journalists, church leaders, and even former Wehrmacht officers referenced them as examples of human re-education through decency. It became a quiet cornerstone of post-war reconciliation, evidence that compassion could transform hearts more deeply than punishment ever could. Years later, when an interviewer asked Helga what the greatest lesson of captivity had been, she replied, "They showed us no hatred, only order, fairness, and food. And in that silence, we discovered how small our idols of pride truly were." Her words reflected the larger truth of the Texas camps. The Americans hadn't just achieved a military triumph, they had revealed a moral one. To the women who once ridiculed the Cowboys' simplicity, their generosity became an argument no ideology could answer. The United States had not forced them to love their captors. It had compelled them to question everything they'd been taught about superiority, purity, and fate. As Helga would later write, "The war taught us how to destroy. Texas taught us how to live again." It wasn't the whip, the rifle, or the uniform that changed her. It was the quiet decency of ordinary men, who believed even enemies deserved respect. As the years passed, Helga never forgot the day she left Texas. She built a new life in post-war Germany, raised a family, and kept her old journal hidden in a wooden box beneath her bed. On its final page, she had written a single line, a sentence that still carried the weight of her transformation. They mocked the cowboy. He fed them instead. That memory stayed vivid. The scent of barbecue drifting through the dry Texas air, the soft laughter of soldiers who refused to hate, and the realization that compassion could outlast empires. She often told her children, America didn't win with guns. It won with decency. And that was the true legacy of those Texas camps. Not the barbed wire or the watchtowers, but the enduring proof that mercy is the most disarming weapon in human history. The same cowboys who once offered bread to their enemies became symbols of something greater, a victory that could not be measured in battles or medals. It was the triumph of spirit over arrogance, of humanity over ideology. They thought we were broken, Helga once said in an interview, but it was they who taught us how to be whole. History often remembers those who fought the hardest. But sometimes, the real victors are the ones who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. And for those who witnessed it, the taste of that kindness, of barbecue, bread, and mercy, lingered far longer than the war itself.